Thank you very much for watching and listening to our episodes in the Central Asia Center. Today we are joined by Eugene. Eugene is a Senior Director for Analytical Developments and Trainings at the New Line Institute. Eugene oversees the institution analytical methodology and forecasting process, and he also manages institutional training efforts.
Thank you for having me, Dania. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Today we're going to be discussing the Caspian region, which sits at one of the world's most consequential crossroads, a very landlocked regions, stretching from the South Caucasus to Central Asia, that has long been shaped by external powers rather than really by its own people. But today, we're going to be unpacking something that is really shifting. Particularly, we're going to be talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine that has already weakened Russia and weakened its capacity to spread influence in the region. We're going to be unpacking China, the Belt and Road initiatives that is facing many challenges, including the rise in debt, and the United States' role under the current administrations in this region when it comes to their foreign policy. Particularly after the peace agreement between Azerbaijan Armenia that was signed on August 2025, and later launching the Trump route for international peace and prosperity through the Armenian territory. So today Eugene's joined us to unpack these topics and questions, and so we will explore whether Russia decline create really a genuine window for Central Asia's economy, touching on the S7+ framework, also how regional states are navigating between the US engagement and the Chinese economic pressures, and whether really there is an ambitious and genuine connectivity project that are likely to happen or not. So I would like to start talking first with you, Eugene, about the Russian or the decline in the Russian influence in the regions and the S7+ opportunity, something that we have been talking a lot about and the Central Asia Center. You also wrote about it and wrote about the connectivity in the regions with another fellow at the Institute, Kamran Bukhari. We also welcomed him here. And so just context here for our audience, Russia has historically dominated Central Asia and South Caucasus through the frameworks like the Collective Security Treaty Organizations and Eurasian Economic Union. And my question is really pertaining to something that you discussed in your recent article on the national interest. In your article, you note that Russia's involvement in Ukraine enabled Azerbaijan to strengthen its position and ultimately led to the August 2025 peace agreement. But here my question is, but the S7+ framework really kind of we're pushing for, we're envisioning Central Asia to be its own regional bloc, kind of independent from Russia and China for the first time. And so the question is, what really do you think makes this moment different from previous attempt to create this Central Asia regionalisms or their own independence, and whether you think it's the right time for this? So this is my first question. And I think another question is, can you help us understand why do you think the Russian involvement in Ukraine kind of enabled or strengthened Azerbaijan position and led ultimately to the peace agreement?
I might take your second question first because I think it nicely ties into the first question. But in terms of how this basically Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine and its having to basically put a lot of its resources, manpower, financing, this did present an opportunity, particularly for Azerbaijan in the Caucasus region, which, as you note, is a very important part of the overall Caspian. And we'll get into all of that, I'm sure, as we go along. So basically, it was through Russia's distraction, and I should note here that Russia played a very important, not only military role, but also diplomatic role as a mediator between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But the conflict that raged, between Armenia and Azerbaijan for well over, a quarter century, going back to even the end of the Soviet period, it was an intractable conflict. There was not much progress being made on the diplomatic front. And so essentially what happened with Russia's sort of diversion in the war in Ukraine was that Azerbaijan was able to militarily regain some territories that it had lost back in, going back to the Soviet period. It did this not only on its own, which it was certainly able to do through things like energy resources, building up its military, but also a regional country like Turkey was able to step in and help Azerbaijan with those efforts as well. So with Russia being more distracted and focused on the Ukrainian theater, this gave an opportunity for other players, most notably Turkey, to step in to make that happen. Now, this happened, over the period of several years, first starting in an escalation that happened in 2020, and then finally in 2023, when Azerbaijan was actually able to reclaim the entirety of the Karabakh region and its surrounding regions. This basically then led to a major diplomatic shift. So while certainly Armenia was on, the losing end of that military conflict, there was a very, quick shift to seeing if they could leverage the new geopolitical reality where Russia is weaker, Turkey is now more active. Of course, you've got other countries like China and Western states, which I'm sure, again, we'll touch on, as we go along, more active in the picture. And then seeing if they could actually use that to unlock a lot of the economic blockages, the connectivity blockages that had existed as a result of this conflict. And so this is basically what quickly pivoted, by both Azerbaijan and Armenia to try to normalize their relations under this new geopolitical reality. And they were actually able to do this, as you've already mentioned kind of in the intro, signing a peace treaty, or at least initialing their intentions to sign the peace treaty. So it has not officially been formalized. That happened last August. And then the result of that was these economic agreements, one of which was the TRIP agreement that you've already mentioned, which the US is a big backer of. And this basically has now unlocked a lot of potential, not only for Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Caucasus, but also across the Caspian Sea to Central Asia.
That's very helpful, kind of stressing on the importance of the Russia war in Ukraine, kind of strengthening Azerbaijan and Turkey stepping in. If we were to take a hypothetical scenario that if Russia, let's say the war with Ukraine, kind of stabilize Russia or reach some kind of settlements, as now today there was a conversations about between Russia and China, Russia and Ukraine today. How would you expect Moscow to respond to initiatives such as the S7 Plus or the initiatives that the United States really kind of was championing on them between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the TRIP agreements. And so what would you think is like the major kind of positions of Moscow would be? And are we looking really at a permanent geopolitical shift or really a temporary window that could affect those Central Asians' economy?
Right. So yeah, it's a very good point that you mentioned in that, as we've been seeing, whether it's S7, whether it's C5+1, now that includes Azerbaijan as well, Russia has always viewed these types of initiatives, I would say, skeptically, if not outright opposed to them. In many ways, it threatens Russia's perceived interests as, the previous dominant power in this region. Obviously, all of these countries were former Soviet countries and before that part of the Russian Empire. So Moscow really does look at this region as its, privileged sphere of influence, quote unquote. So any efforts, whether that be by the European states or especially by the United States, in order to kind of get closer to these countries, is viewed very suspiciously by Moscow. Now, because it has been weakened, I think, as a power in this region, largely but not exclusively because of the war in Ukraine, this does, give that opportunity for such initiatives to really take form, and that's why I think we've seen a lot of progress. Of course, you have to give credit to the states themselves for their level of coordination there. But it is important to mention here that while Russia has been weakened, it's still very much an active player in this region. It still has, with Central Asian countries, for example, military ties, in some cases even military presence in these countries. It's got the same in Armenia, although Yerevan is certainly trying to diversify from that. So I think that if Russia were to be able to end the war in Ukraine or somehow gain from the war in Ukraine, I would argue the opposite has been the case so far. That would definitely bring up the reality that Russia is still going to be an active player in this region. Now, how much, to what extent it could influence or even spoil such initiatives, obviously will be dependent on how much it's able to maneuver all of these other areas and all of these other theaters that it's involved in. I think that the directionality has certainly been that Russia has been relatively weakening as Turkey, even to some extent China, and certainly the Western countries have been more engaged in this region. But Moscow will always be a player to some extent.
We discussed about Moscow and we discussed about the Armenia-Azerbaijan situations. If we were to focus on Armenia, it looks like Armenia right now is kind of pivot. Their westward is kind of striking. I mean, it's essentially really Armenia is abandoning its relationship with Russia. It looks like to that point, despite these remaining treaties, for example, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Do you see these similar reorientations happening between Central Asia or the five economies distancing themselves from Moscow, like Armenia right now? It looks like kind of taking that position.
Yeah, so as with all things in this region, as I'm sure you well know, there's a lot of nuance, and there's kind of the devil is into the details here. So I completely agree that Armenia is trying to diversify its relationship. I mean, what we talked about at the beginning in terms of this war over Karabakh, I mean, Russia was Armenia's security guarantor, and it did not step in at all to assist Armenia, right? And there's several reasons for that, but certainly the war in Ukraine is a big one for that. So I think it was as a result of that Armenia really had to re-examine its foreign policy orientation. It had been overwhelmingly dependent on Russia, not only for security, but also economically, so on and so forth. And it saw that, its largest partner was basically not there to assist it in the greatest time of need. So it's been, it has, as a result of that, it has looked more to enhance ties with the West, with Europe and the United States. It's also framing why Armenia is now more open to rebuilding its ties with Azerbaijan, for both economic, and diplomatic reasons. But it still does, Armenia still does maintain, some level of ties with Russia. I mean, Russia still, as of right now, at least, has a security presence on Armenia, although that's changing, gradually, I would say. For the Central Asian countries, it's a little bit more complicated still, because these countries, are a little bit further removed from the European vector. Armenia, at least, is geographically closer, right? It has some positioning that it can kind of really leverage. Central Asia, further away from Europe, further away from the United States. Both geographically and I would also say politically in many ways as well. Central Asia has borders with China and in Kazakhstan's case with Russia as well. So they have to take that reality into account. But I think similar to Armenia and Azerbaijan, they are looking to diversify and enhance their relationship with the United States and with the EU, from an economic standpoint. But they also want to maintain to some degree their ties with both China and with Russia. Really, the multi-vector foreign policy, which is, I think, a key word here for countries like Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, as well as that these countries are looking to, because they're landlocked, as you mentioned, they're looking to try to leverage as many relationships as possible for their own economic growth, for their own development, and have a kind of foreign policy balance that can meet their own national interests.
It looks like from the conversation that Russia is losing really kind of the countries that they used to have influence in, right? It looks like Armenia and the other Central Asian economy, and this is because of the war in Ukraine. Again, if we were to think about China at this point, I want to just discuss with you the Chinese, because China kind of influence in these economies is very different than Russia and how they're pushing themselves, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative plan. My question is, China has recently signed comprehensive treaties with all these five Central Asian economy in June 2025, and the Belt and Road investment in the regions are increasing, right? They're investing in different sectors and different industries. At the same time as we are, the New Lines Institute really pushing for the S7+ frameworks, kind of to give the Central Asian economy independence and agency over their own economy. I guess my question is how do you describe and see how these economies are really navigating between kind of keeping the relationship with China while at the same time kind of working toward like independency in their economy? I mean, it's a tensions and it's a difficult positions. So how would you describe it and kind of analyze it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the China factor here is very important. And actually, this was a shift that was happening even well before the war in Ukraine, where, as with Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Central Asian states historically were tied in many ways, economically, security to Russia. But over the past decade or so, and because of the Belt and Road Initiative, as you mentioned, Central Asia plays a very important role in that. So we've seen large-scale investment going back to 10, 15 years from China. There's a kind of a mutual sort of beneficial arrangement there because Central Asian states have a lot of energy resources like, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan being major oil and or gas producers. There's also they play a very important geographic role for China being a transit to broader markets onto Europe. So and China, of course, having its own, major economic growth and a lot of resources to invest, supplanted Russia as the major trading and overall economic partner in Central Asia. And this is going back several years now, right? Because Russia didn't need those energy resources. It's an energy exporter in and of itself, and it didn't really have the type of economy or the investment potential that China did in Central Asia. Now, in terms of these countries kind of having their own autonomy and developing their own systems, I think that's a very important point that you mentioned, Dania. And I think this is where having more players, especially the United States and the EU, which are becoming more active, I think will enable those countries to have more autonomy and more maneuverability. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they completely cut off all of their relations, whether that be with China or even for Russia, that for that matter, right? It's just about not being overwhelmingly dependent, and certainly the Belt and Road Initiative has had a lot of debt dependencies and things of that nature. Russia has made clear, its dependencies can be very challenging for some of its allies. So being able to kind of shed some of those more difficult dependencies while maintaining some level of economic relationships, I think is something that the Central Asian states can now really take advantage of. And the opening to the other side of the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan and onward onto Europe, major initiatives like the Middle Corridor, which imagine connecting China to Europe and the Central Asia playing a very important node or even choke point in that relationship. I think all of this can and should give the Central Asian states more maneuverability so that they can grow their economies, but do so in a way that doesn't lead to any unstable or over dependence on countries, whether that be China or Russia.
So you mentioned something important. You mentioned that they're having relationship with the United States and Europe can help these economies have agency and kind of build their own independence, kind of from being overly dependent on China or Russia. What do you think the United States and Europe can offer these economies that China cannot or is unable right now, given everything that, all the investments? And so what is kind of the United States, I guess, advantages and competitive advantages compared to China and Russia?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Well, first of all, I think the inherent advantage that both the US and EU, but especially the US have, are that they're not geographically present there in the way that China and Russia are, which has obviously historically and up until present day led to some very, overwhelming or dominant, relationships. So that's number one, that they don't want to physically, territorially control these countries, that their interest is in things like economic development, mutually beneficial relations, so forth, so on and so forth. Another element here is that, if we're looking at the TRIP, for example, the US has, levels of technology that it can offer. It has more beneficial terms, in many cases than either China or Russia can offer in such types of economic relationships. And it has the diplomatic power to serve as the mediating role that I think Russia and China have not proven to have. We started with the example of the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiation process. Russia, was a mediator in that conflict for almost 3 decades, and yet we didn't see a breakthrough, largely because I don't think Russia wanted a breakthrough. But now we've seen in the case of the US just over the past year where it had the ability not to start, because these negotiations had already begun, before the Trump administration came into office, but it had the diplomatic heft to be able to really push it through. And actually to see a level of engagement between for example, Azerbaijan and Armenia, that hadn't taken place in many decades. We've seen the U.S. and its approach with this, the Central Asian countries in terms of offering different types of investment opportunities for things like critical minerals. Again, all not with the goal to exploit or to dominate, right, but to have these mutually beneficial economic relationships that can have certainly geopolitical, implications, right? So I think there's a combination of unique things that the West, and particularly the U.S., can contribute to these countries in the broader picture, I would say.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I want to shift the ears to another conversation, another topic, particularly asking some questions about your recent piece in the National Interest about the Trans-Caspian connectivity, the U.S. engagement, the Armenian Azerbaijan kind of recent piece, I would say, or intentions to sign a formalized peace agreement. You wrote in that piece that the Caspian region has emerged as a critical example of Trump transactional foreign peace, securing peace deals, energy access, and the critical minerals, while deprioritizing democracy and human rights concerns. So 6 months after the August agreement, how would you assess the implementations of these conversations around peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia? And do you think it's actually translating into an actual genuine connectivity, or are we still at the there is an MOU right now, both of them, they signed an MOU, so it's not yet formalized. So are we still at just a MOU, or are we really looking forward into an actual formalized agreement between them?
Yeah, so I will say in the 6 months or so that's transpired since that initial, the high level agreement that at the White House with Azerbaijan's president and Armenia's prime minister, sort of moderated by President Trump, we've actually seen a lot of activity. I would say almost daily, weekly activity that's at that kind of the technical and working level, which I think is very important to track, right? Because on the one hand, you have these large-scale diplomatic agreements, right, which are obviously important from a symbolic standpoint, but really the devil's in the details to implement them. And so whether you're talking about cargo transit for the first time taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan directly a few months ago, we've seen agreements being signed. We've seen some level of implementation very much at the tactical level. I will note that it is still early on, right? There's still a lot of work to be done in order to really enhance this region along with Central Asia as a major transit hub, as a major trade and connectivity hub. But that work is being done. And I think that, even as of today, there were reports, out of Armenia that the peace treaty is getting very close in terms of the formal, signing of it. It's important to mention here that Armenia has elections coming up later this year in the summer, which will be very important, to see what direction that will take, whether it's a continuation or potentially some kind of shift. But I think if we do see a continued commitment out of both sides, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, on that front past those elections, that will unlock even more levels of concrete, infrastructure development and these connectivity and trade initiatives. Every day we're seeing some level of U.S. delegations or EU agreements on everything from energy deals to transit to rail traffic expansion, so on and so forth. So it has moved beyond the MOU stage, but in the big scheme of things, there's still a long way to go as well.
So this is good news that to start with, the relationship between these two economies and how it has evolved and improved. If we were to look at some of the challenges facing the trip or the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, we have two economies here. U.S., first of all, has definitely a high stake in Armenia and in the politics and the economy of Armenia. But we have two challenges here. Iran has already threatened to block the route and kind of expressed their total disagreement on all these kind of relationships of the United States with Armenia. Also, Moscow doesn't look like very much encouraging for those relationships. Moscow condemned these agreements. And so how serious do you see those threats are really impacting the relationships and impacting the peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan? So are really serious? Do you see any future or any analysis for what these threats really kind of signaling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are still challenges, especially those that you mentioned, to actually seeing this really grow and come to fruition as a truly kind of game-changing connectivity corridor. Now, I mean, just simply by its geography alone, whether it's the Caucasus or Central Asia or the Caspian region overall, presents itself kind of an inherent challenge, right? This is, as you mentioned, it's a landlocked region. It's in the middle of the vast Eurasian supercontinent. And not only that, but it's also surrounded by these quite active geopolitical hotspots, right? You have the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which we've already talked about. Obviously, all of the the various conflicts happening in the Middle East. Azerbaijan has and some Central Asian countries have borders with Iran, for example, which is experiencing quite a lot of geopolitical volatility at the moment. Not to mention the Gaza theater, so on and so forth. And then less so from a military standpoint, but obviously U.S.-China tensions and things like trade and technology. This region is sort of caught in the middle in many ways of all of those active global hotspots. So that is a challenge in and of itself. But having said that, it's very notable that even as many of these hotspots have become more dynamic, we actually have been seeing some of the opposite effects happening in the Central Asia and Caspian region. And what I mean by that is that where you have a lot of geopolitical competition and geopolitical activity, usually leading to some level of disruption of trade, like we saw, as a result of the Gaza conflict, in terms of shipping, in terms of energy supplies, as we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so on and so forth. We've actually been experiencing the opposite effect in the Caspian region, where we've seen diplomatic progress actually lead to concrete agreements, and those agreements being translated into the enhancement of trade, whether it's on energy supplies, agricultural supplies, critical minerals, so on and so forth. So it's very, I think, notable to see that even amidst geopolitical volatility and in this geopolitical hotspot, which this region will always be located where it is, right? You can't change your location. But it's actually been able to make a lot of advancements despite all of that. So yes, I think it will be very important to watch, obviously, Russia and Iran as potential challengers to these efforts, but they have always been that, and yet we've seen, despite that, a lot of progress. And because they're actually facing their own challenges, I think that we're going to see even more progress still.
So what do you think are the major factors that really describe, like in politics, we know very well, like when you are on a border of another country, you're more likely to have kind of the domino, spreading of what's going on in the other country to your country. And you highlighted a very important point that despite all this ongoing volatility around these economies, they're still kind of maintaining their work, their relationship, their trades. And so what would you describe one or two factors that really help protect these economies from all these surrounding volatility, like particularly Iran? And what's going on in Iran, because they are on the borders, and there are a lot of similarities and groups of, ethnic groups between Iran's and Azerbaijan and Armenia, and so there's a lot of overlaps in the ethnic and the religious compositions of these two economies. So what would you think would be one factor that kind of protected those economies from this volatility?
That's a good question. I think one element that I would point to, and I brought this up before, which is this idea of a multi-vector foreign policy. So whether you're talking about, whether it's Azerbaijan, which, has a border with Iran, whether it's Kazakhstan, which has borders with Russia and China, these countries are very careful and actually quite sophisticated in terms of balancing their foreign policy relationships. And that doesn't mean that they're best friends with these countries like Iran, Russia, and China, right? But they recognize that, those countries are realities to them.
Right.
They have to deal with them to some extent. So having, very tense or adversarial relationships can have very significant implications. So what they've done is being able to maintain some level of diplomatic ties and economic, and even in some cases security ties with these countries, even as they're exploring enhancing their relationship with the US and the EU, and just as importantly, enhancing their relationships with one another. Central Asian countries, for example, had a lot of different, tensions within the region, whether over, border issues or water issues, which I know is a critical element of the S7 concept. But they've done a lot to enhance their own relationships, which has now facilitated them to be more interconnected, to be more integrated with one another, and to be able to deal better with their regional challenges, right? So I think it's that awareness and the reality that they have to be very adept at diplomatic maneuvering so that they can avoid and sort of preempt some of the spillover that would happen from these more volatile areas.
I think this makes complete sense. I mean, one, I think what you said makes complete sense and really kind of speak to the point. To echo exactly what you said, when the United States kind of went through Venezuela, which is a very close friend to Russia, none of the Central Asians economy took a statement or made a statement kind of to protect the relationship with the United States, but also to protect the relationship with Russia. So there was no any statement from them on such big political activity. So I think that makes complete sense. You highlighted that Armenia is preparing for an election this summer. Also, Armenia kind of also faces a constitutional referendum in 2027 to kind of ratify the changes that are required by the peace agreement. And the Prime Minister of Armenia could face like a parliamentary elections in 2026, like you highlighted. If his government falls, or if the elections does not produce the desirable results, or the referendum fails, what happens to the U.S. blocked framework? What can we talk about the Armenians' elections and the Armenians' politics when it comes to the U.S. Agreements with Azerbaijan and hopefully the treaty that they will sign?
Yeah, it's a very good question. One I've thought about and talked with many of my Armenian colleagues and contacts as well. And basically, this is I would say it's an important point to note that because we're not at the formal conclusion of the peace treaty, and as we've talked about, while those economic connectivity projects have started to get off the ground, there's still a long way to go. There's no guarantee that it's all going to continue to go into that, positive, constructive direction. And domestic political situations, including that in Armenia, are, potentially one of those challenges. Now, from my understanding and, from my discussions that I've had, there's a strong belief that, whether it's the current Armenian government or a future government, that the benefits of the opening up, not only to countries like Azerbaijan, but also to Turkey as well. So both of them had basically, isolated Armenia or did not have trading relationships with Armenia. Because that has now seen some progress, it would be very disadvantageous for Armenia to go back on that now. The over-reliance on Russia, economically has, it's felt, for every individual Armenian. And I think most people, regardless of which party or leader that they support, recognize the benefits of continuing this process. So certainly it would be smoother if, just for the purposes of the TRIP agreement, for the peace agreement, I think it would be smoother if there is a continuation of the current government. But even if that's not the case, I think that there's still a lot of broader momentum that's not tied directly to any particular personality or party. But, as you said, that is one of those elements that could potentially, delay or complicate some of the efforts that we've seen up until now, depending on how those elections go. There are sensitivities there, of course, in any post-conflict environment. It's very understandable, but I think that the broader momentum certainly is there towards greater connectivity.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And then one question is related also to the United States and the EU efforts here. So in your recent piece, you argue and you discuss that Central Asian states have leveraged U.S. transactional interest to secure trade and investment benefits now that democracy and human rights are no major stumbling blocks here. Do you think this is a sustainable basis for U.S. engagement, or does it create kind of credibility problems that could undermine long-term partnerships with these economies?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the geopolitical realities that are currently facing, this region. So I think that, while it is important to advance, these types of things, the Central Asian countries and I would say the Caucasus states as well, have an interest in that further integration. And I think even previous U.S. administrations were interested in that as well from a strategic standpoint, right? But for various political reasons, there were some stumbling blocks there. So I think it's very notable. For example, you mentioned, with our colleague Kamran Bukhari, we had jointly written this large policy piece on Trans-Caspian connectivity several years ago. And there was some interest in that, but we've seen really over the past year, a lot of the policy recommendations that we had made have really started to come to fruition. So there, as with anything, there's a lot of complications here, and I think certainly I would advocate for the U.S. to have its values intact and to be able to promote those, while also recognizing that this is a strategic region. You're competing with other countries like Russia and China that do not share those values, and I think it can be a gradual process, to promote that level of stability and openness within these countries in a pragmatic way.
Yeah, thank you so much about this. Just to like discuss more and to wrap up this conversation. So looking at the full picture of the S7, the TRIP, the C5+1, and the EU Trans-Caspian connectivity agenda, we're seeing multiple frameworks for the United States and EU to kind of get involved and to support this integration, this regional integrations. What do you think is still missing in the region to actually meet this full connectivity, particularly from a domestic politics kind of perspective rather than a foreign policy perspective? What do you think the people or the institutions or certain reforms domestically for kind of to implement that connectivity big project for the region, especially that many of these economies are not democratic economies, and they have been going through a lot of issues with their political systems and stability. So do you see this could be a challenge, or the economy and the politics are not really related or correlated here?
Yeah, the way that I see it, there's not anything in particular that's sorely missing, but certainly there can be improvements in a lot of the different areas that you've mentioned, because while this process has been going on for, I would say probably the past few years or so, it's still relatively early, and there's still a lot of these historical legacies to overcome, whether that be conflict, whether that be, interstate conflict, whether that be internal issues, things of that nature. But what we're seeing right now is a clear path towards, whether you're talking about within Central Asia or whether you're talking about between Armenia and Azerbaijan, closer ties within these countries, more agency being shown by these countries. And yes, the foreign actors will continue to be present, whether it is the US and the EU or Russia and China. But I think that they are more and more taking matters into their own hands and working with these countries rather than being dominated by them or being influenced by them, to negative consequences. So I think as long as that continues to happen, a lot of the issues that you raise will get addressed, I think, in organic ways. It's not going to look exactly like the United States or the EU, which, quite frankly, we have our own political challenges, in the West as well. But, whether it's more openness, whether it's more representation and more inclusion and more economic development, which I think everybody can agree on within these regions, I think that momentum is certainly there. It just needs to be sustained. And here is where I will bring up the fact that, the U.S. has had shifts in government, right? And that can lead to pretty significant shifts in foreign policy. This is something that I think will need to be, addressed and incorporated, that we have a long-term vision for supporting Central Asia, for supporting the Caspian region, that regardless of who is the president, whether that's 3 years from now or 10 years from now, that is a broader kind of overall strategic approach. And with that, I think that a lot can be accomplished, both for the United States, but especially for this region.
This is very helpful. I have two questions and to wrap up this, but I want to ask you, you said regardless of the leaders, whether Republican or Democrats, we should be supporting that region. I think my question is, how would you describe the importance and the impact of this project for the United States, whether for a Republican leader or Democratic leader? What is really kind of the main benefit, the main advantage, the main point for the United States to keep supporting that region? I mean, it's very clear why Russia is engaged, why China is engaged, but how would you describe it for the United States foreign and national security interest?
So yeah, I would say there's two main things that I would point to here. Number one is, there are clear just economic advantages for the U.S. And for Europe to be engaged in this region. As I mentioned, it's a very strategically located region. It can be a major transit hub of everything from overall trade to energy to minerals, agriculture, so on and so forth. And that is why I think that there's been a lot of interest, for TRIP, for example, for unblocking some of those artificial, I think, barriers to trade there. So there's from a very pragmatic and practical reason, I think it's a great investment and economic opportunity. But the second point and the broader point here is geopolitical in nature, which is that this is an arena for competition, and this is an arena where some of the U.S.'s leading adversaries like Russia and China, and even to some extent Iran, have been quite active and influential in this region. So there's an opportunity for the U.S. to be more competitive, to be more influential, and to do so with its own values and things in mind, because certainly those countries don't share that. So there's both very practical, benefits for engagement, but there's also very much institutional and values-based benefits there, I would say, as well.
So my last question for today is, what would you think one important element that these economies have to focus on to really kind of translate all these economic activities or economic ideas into an actual transformation? What would you call one element or one factor that they have to really dedicate their focus on?
Yeah, I would say, it's kind of similar to my previous answer. There's two key elements. On the practical economic side, there's still a lot to be done to enhance the infrastructure to really make this region a major transit hub, for all of those reasons that I mentioned. So whether you're talking about the expansion of roads, rails, pipelines, things of that nature, making sure that you're kind of building out plans and incorporating them. That's number one. And number two, kind of tying back to what we talked about, is being able to maneuver in a geopolitically volatile neighborhood, right? This is something that I think that we've seen, in the past. We're seeing it very active currently. And this is actually where I'm quite optimistic that, whether it's Central Asia, whether it's Azerbaijan and Armenia, despite everything that's going on around them, and in some ways, because of it, they've been able to maintain stability. They've been able to enhance their own regional integration, and they've been able to actually benefit and position themselves as this major transit and an economically important zone. So maneuvering geopolitically and then doing the hard work on the ground, I think, will be the recipe for success.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eugene Chausovsky. Thank you for helping us understand these complex dynamics. For all listeners who would like to learn and read Eugene piece articles titled "How U.S. Engagements Accelerate Trans-Caspian Connectivity," it is on the national interest. We'll also put the link in our podcast. And the New Lines Works has published a lot right now on the S7 framework. If you would like to learn more about the S7 Plus framework, it's on our website. Also, we will link it to the podcast.